Carl Berry. There we go. Let me just provide a little brief introduction here. So Carl Berry is a lecturer in criminology at the University of Bristol in the UK. And the title of his presentation today is Control, Resistance, and Compliance, Understanding Electronic Monitoring's Contradictory Life as a Failure to Regulate. Carl Berry is a lecturer in criminology currently at the University of Bristol. His PhD research was an ambitious ethnographic investigation of criminal offenders subject to the penalty of electronic monitoring in a city in England. Deploying the novel approach of actor network theory, this investigation took seriously the idea that material objects have agency, in this case, the physical electronic monitoring equipment, which comes to lead a highly variable life when co-joined to its user host. It showed that despite being designed to control offenders, whether being on tag becomes a genuine punishment depends on a range of different changing factors in hosts' lives, and that often it does not. Still, it shows that being subject to electronic monitoring is a highly intrusive experience which holds the potential for worsening mental health, domestic conflict, and often hinders positive steps such as gaining employment. Nevertheless, it frequently fails in its objectives of controlling crime, except in a very limited and temporary manner to the detriment of all. And with that, I will pass off this presentation to Carl. And Carl, you do have 18 minutes, or I should say, yeah, you have 18 minutes. And I will give you a polite, gentle reminder at the 2-minute warning to cut you off. So without further ado, please go ahead, Carl. Carl, I believe you're muted.
There you go. Okay, yep. Thank you very much, James. I've got my stopwatch going, is what I was saying, so I'll be able to keep a track of the time, hopefully myself as well. And thank you very much for that very generous welcome. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. You will see that? Brilliant. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for James for reaching out to me, and Eleanor and Hannah for organising this roundtable discussion, which I'm sure will provoke some fascinating debate. I need to start with a confession, as I did in my breakout room. I'm not actually a carceral geographer. My knowledge of the perspective has come principally through James's excellent PhD, which he finished a year or so before mine, on the same criminological topic, namely electronic monitoring, or EM, or tagging, as it's known more colloquially. I have to thank James again for acquainting me with some of the arguments of carceral geography and its approach towards ethnographic research, which, although distinctive, shares, I think, some important similarities with the ethnographic approach I used, which was heavily influenced by trying to understand how both space and time were controlled and reconfigured by EM. So I'll probably have a lot to learn today. Okay. So my objective today is to try to answer some puzzling questions I still have about EM related to what I call its contradictory life, by attempting to find some common ground between the way it was conceptualized through carceral geography and the approach I adapted, actor network theory, or ANT. I'll do this by outlining some of the key findings of this respective research and some ideas from these differing perspectives before trying to carve out a critical reappraisal of EM. At my heart, I still think of myself as a critical criminologist, but making entirely critical arguments about EM is sometimes difficult, as I'll get into, though I still have some major disagreements with the likes of Bruno Latour and Michel Callon, ANTers. I found the approach to be useful in considering this contradictory existence because of, as the title of the presentation states, it often fails to regulate. So it might be useful to provide a brief rundown of the project before unpicking these theoretical arguments. So I'll tell you a bit about its methodology aims and perhaps most importantly, some of its main empirical findings. The research is an ethnography of 21 EM users and 11 supporting actors in a place called EM City. I had to anonymize the location, but I'll leave it to you to guess where it is. You can probably tell from my accent, maybe. It used interviews and observations over the course of user sentences and sometimes passed it where I could. It deployed ANT to try to understand firstly how outcomes of compliance and criminal desistance arose from the measure or not, as the case sometimes vividly was, And secondly, tried to understand how the lived experience of enforced surveillance led different perspectives or affects to emerge. This idea of emerging outcomes is important to ANT because it tries to avoid causal arguments, although this is debated, but more of that later. Although locating the context of EM to expanding surveillance and control within society, while trying to avoid the kind of bland policy relevant research, which is interesting, or should I say, useful, but not often that interesting. My approach, I tried to look at the issue neutrally, right? Because despite what we think as criminologists, being on tag might be viewed as helpful by some people or not especially punitive. The question is why. And indeed, through gathering these narratives of technology from users, they did begin to divide into sometimes positive, but often neutral and ambivalent, and sometimes negative accounts. What became clear is that despite many minor complaints and violations, most actually stuck to their curfews and saw it quite neutrally as just a kind of temporary inconvenience that would soon be removed. This is perhaps not unsurprising, given that the longest sentence I encountered was 6 months and most were tagged for around 6 to 12 weeks, and many had been tagged multiple times already anyway. Nevertheless, some continued to offend quite seriously and violate their curfews, often with absolutely zero sanctioning. One account involves a serious bar fight that resulted in one participant committing several brutal assaults in front of me, and one of those was very bad indeed. A minority did experience it very punitively, though, often those from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, but some the opposite, right, benevolently as a help. How this connected to compliance and assistance was complicated, though, and probably requires a much larger data sets, or probably quantitative research to discover meaningful relationships. I strongly contend that as ethnographers, we need to take these accounts at face value. If someone says that being on tag actually helped them develop organizational skills and avoid trouble, then that's that. They aren't mistaken or naive. Right, the picture on the slide was shared to me by a participant who looked back positively on their sentence. We can ask, of course, why it took this piece of penal equipment to do that, and what this says about the lack of support surrounding quite taken for granted skills many people acquire at a young age in our society. Although this, I think, doesn't necessarily negatively throw shade at EM, it's simply implemented in that vacuum. One thing I think is abundantly clear from the research, though, is that the strength and quality of users' extended relations, particularly in regards to employment and supporting actors, family, etc., were the most important factors in understanding their compliance and assistance to EM and its affects. Deficits in these things that many offenders have lead to the failure of EM to regulate, and these are things that the technology of EM simply cannot replace. But anyway, let's move on to the theoretical part of the discussion. ANT makes many claims, some quite contentious, and I'll try to pick out the main lines of argument that I got from it while trying to be brief. ANT takes seriously the idea, controversially perhaps, that non-human actors have agency and are central in the creation and maintenance of human society. Bruno Latour asserts that technologies are society-made durable. They allow social ends to be achieved through material means, but they can also act in their own right. They aren't just synecdoche for societal objectives. They are as much a part of society as you and I are. This is very debated, though. I anticipate it might get discussed. It also asserts, ANT that is, that human society consists of many dynamic and overlapping networks which are connected by these actors who exist both at individual and aggregate levels. And it is these associations that are of interest for sociologists. For these networks, which can become actors to function, actors must translate their commands or their desires faithfully. Failure in this results in the failure of these associations. So ANT is always emphasizing the shaping and reshaping and breaking and re-breaking of society. Furthermore, sociology for Latour is to start from the ground up. Researchers are to follow the actors, to watch what they do and simply describe and record their activities rather than provide critical analysis, although the extent to which ANTers actually do this themselves is heavily debated. The focus is on outcome in ANT. Rather than start with the idea that something like EM is harsh and controlling, the objective is to understand the process of how it becomes so for the actors involved. However, ANT has many limitations. Many of the assertions of critical criminologists, and indeed, I'd imagine carceral geographers about much of the EM program still chime through without having to follow the actors and much more besides. However, the situation is complex and often contradictory. Still, we must not lose sight of the woods for the trees, as the saying goes, yet neither must we look at the phenomenon monodirectionally. Okay, so my apologies in advance. I tried to discuss carceral geography from my reading of James's and Dominique's work, which he often cites. So from my limited understanding, it's a growing dialogue between geography and criminology, which focuses on how spatial and temporal territory are transformed to become punishing and controlling, besides criminalized and much more besides. Much of this work develops Foucault's dispersal of carceral power thesis. In other words, that surveillance and the punitivization of physical and social space mean that much of life and society is becoming like a prison. These writings are, though, also cognizant of the movement away from discipline to control in the so-called punitive turn of neoliberalism, which is observable in how architecture, technologies, infrastructure, and policy are less concerned with transforming individual subjects, as in the age of penal welfarism, but attempt the simple control of behaviors through things like hostile architecture, CCTV, online space, and of course, EM. Carceral geography also makes methodological claims. It compels researchers to immerse themselves in these environments to experience and record the way the carceralization of space is realized. Gaychek develops Cohen's work in Visions of Social Control to understand how in the age of control, punishment in the community through EM achieves this control over users and exemplifies this trend. It noted how EM sits amongst the spectrum of surveillance infrastructure, G4S HQ, G4S fans, G4S personnel, CCTV, and the prison, of course, which invaded the lives of EM users and kept them very closely monitored. But as Foucault said, power defines itself through resistance. So how to make sense of these lines of accord and discord? Concerning the former, both investigations showed how surveillance has become central to how criminal populations, indeed the lower class in general, are subject to intensive monitoring and the diffusion of carceral power into the community, the home, and even mediates their intimate relationships. My participants sometimes indicated this through how bonds with their children, spouses, and family members were strangely impacted by becoming visible to the criminal justice system, which was tangibly felt via the physical equipment. This is also achieved for a vast surveillance architecture or assemblage, in Latourian terms, in wider society, including not just penal infrastructure, but increasingly voluntarily through commodities. A smartphone is more sophisticated than a tag, and we keep them with us most of the time. Our social media feed monitors every click and scroll, sending targeted ads to us through neuromarketing, so-called neuromarketing. That being said, I still claim that EM has some quite messy scripting. It has several penal philosophies that are emphasized to greater or lesser extents, depending upon the jurisdiction in which it's being used. It certainly has some rehabilitative qualities, though it's debated how much. Still, it's designed to definitely do one thing, and that thing is to control users' whereabouts through digitized curfews. However, in practice, it also often fails to regulate and or provoke particularly punitive emotion. So the question then becomes, what does this mean for critical criminology? How can we stay critical of EM while acknowledging its inability to often effectively carceralize space? Well, we could say that the very fact that EM users are ambivalent is actually a concern by itself, right? What does this say about the creep of surveillance and the criminalization of so many people in society? We've become desensitized to it, perhaps. That some EM users may often continue serious offending, which causes significant social harms to the wider community, is also alarming. The picture on the right is a snap of that. That it fails to rehabilitate many users, again, points to critical policy failure. but you could say, is the glass empty or half full? Some might get some positives from this. Still, I would argue that that's a pretty low bar for success, which begs the question, who is really benefiting from the program, given that similar programs with a low value to cost ratio would have likely ended by now within the criminal justice system. Still, I think we must listen to users who show that EM assists in some.
Carl, you're actually muted.
Hi, where did I get to?
I believe the issues with policy.
Okay, all right, yep, so, okay, so, yep, we're just at the final bit now. So we must still listen to users who show that EM assists in sometimes building pro-social skills and routines that can extend post-sentence. Although appearing on a continuum of penal power, it is at the less severe end, and certainly it's less than prison, according to most of the people that I interviewed. Although I did find a few who preferred the certainty of prison over the constant anxiety that arose from being under observation. Mike Nellis, who took my Viva, shared a story about a probationer he knew who got his tag tattooed onto his leg after it got taken off to remind him of his curfew. Well, might be an extreme example, but there you go, proves the point. So given that EM probably isn't going anywhere, it might be pragmatic to ask, what do we want from it? I've personally become more critical in my outlook of EM since actually finishing my PhD and coming across more work that takes a social harms approach, like semiology, towards the crime issue, as it allows for a critical stance related to EM's failures, which can be seen as leading to wider social harms. This quote is from a participant called Shane, who was imprisoned for breaching his EM bail order after our first interview, and was imprisoned again about 6 months after this testimony. He showed an acute awareness of the fact that EM in England and Wales mainly benefited the authorities, yet simultaneously didn't work. So looking back, do you think the tag helped at all? No, I wouldn't say it did. I don't think it does help people, to be honest. It just restricts the fun you can have. So I wouldn't say it really helps you. Tags a strange one, because it's like, if anything, it helps the authorities, the police and things like that. I wouldn't say it helps the person who's on it, because if they're going to do something, they're going to do it the day before their curfew, or they're just going to wait till the next day and go out and do it. It's not like the tag's going to stop them from doing something. Most people these days, if they want to do something, they just go breach their tag and do it. So I wouldn't say it helps anyone. It's a shit thing, really. Like, there's other things they can do instead of tag, like prison. I wouldn't say none of that helps, because in prison, no one rehabilitates there. They got like 300 officers for 600 people. Notwithstanding Shane's astute critique, which I think in one sentence sums up the failures of EM more than the probable millions of words which have been written about it, my criticisms are more towards EM's implementation rather than the device per se. Technologies like EM, for the main part, despite malfunctioning, do what they're programmed to do. They aren't inherently bad in that sense. They become that way, although I'm sure people might argue with that. And there are certainly examples of technologies which are inherently badly scripted. EM was partially, at least initially, devised with the hope of decreasing the use of prison. Its capacity for net widening is still debated, but ultimately it emerged alongside the extension of the penal state and became a part of it. So the question, I think, remains.
Remaining, Carl.
Okay, almost there. Can EM become a part of a justice system which revolves around harm reduction if it is to stay? Penal abolitionists argue against this and look towards shrinking the penal state altogether while tackling the well-established and long-standing economic and social causes of crime, like poverty, homelessness, unemployment, a lack of education skills, neglect, substance misuse, etc. Indeed, EM simply does not work as a standalone measure, and it cannot do the job that society should. Nevertheless, barring a revolution in the immediate future, this would be a long project, but something I think EM could still potentially be a part of. Today, I think we should perhaps look at these things more closely when invoking Orwellian comparisons, as EM's capacity as a catalyst for igniting a dystopian landscape seems to be questionable. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carl. A lot to think about and a lot to consider. Don't worry if, as you indicated, you're not a carceral geographer, you're a critical criminologist. I too am a critical criminologist, but this wonderful working group has lovingly embraced me. So we are happy to include anyone who incorporates carceral geography. So have no fear. Your work is certainly along those lines. And so it's very nice and it's very fortunate to have you be a part of our working group today, and so much food for thought. So I really appreciate that, especially drawing on some of my own work. I know some of the findings that we have are very similar. And so I think that's just fantastic. I think there's a great conversation to be had. So thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you.
So in terms of the next presentation here, let me just introduce our next presentation. Carl, if you want to, there we go, wonderful. Here we go. Yes. So in terms of the next presentation, we have Rachel Andrews, who is a PhD candidate at NUI Galway in Ireland. And the title of her presentation today is Repair, Gendered Placemaking at the Unmarked Children's Grave at the Tuam Mother and Baby Home, Galway, Ireland, 2014 to 2021. Rachel Andrews' critical creative doctoral studies at the National University of Ireland, Galway, seek to investigate the significance of unmarked burial sites in the Irish collective memory and culture. She is presented at Irish Studies conferences in Prague and Concordia University in Montreal, and at the Conference of Irish Geographers. Her journalistic and prose work on the topic has been published in the London Review of Books and Gore's Literary Journal. My apologies. All right. And I will turn it over to you, Rachel, and you are all ready to go. Oh. Carl, do you need to stop sharing your screen? Oh, I think it actually stopped already. Never mind.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. It just wouldn't let me unmute there. So I'll start my
Quite all right, Rachel. So glad you were here. I was worried for a second.
Sorry. Okay, so I'll just share my screen and whoops. Okay, so thanks everyone. I suppose I'm not a carceral geographer either, but my PhD work, as James was saying there, is looking at sites, unmarked grave sites in the Irish collective memory and culture. And some of these you would suggest are carceral sites, in that carceral institutions were on these sites. And so there is the legacy there. So I'm looking at several case studies as part of my PhD work. And this particular presentation is on the space of the Tuam Mother and Baby Home unmarked grave site, where I'm just looking at as it says here, placemaking, gendered and community placemaking that has taken place on that site. So I'll just go ahead. These are images of the Tuam Babies graveyard from around 2014. And in 2014, on May 25th, 2014, the reporter Alison O'Reilly ran a story on the front page of the Irish Mail on Sunday. The introduction to the article stated, "A mass grave beside a former home for unmarried mothers may contain the bodies of almost 800 babies." A week later, the international media took up the story. Historian believes bodies of 800 babies long dead are in a tank at Irish home for unwed mothers, wrote the Washington Post. The information regarding the almost 800 children, most under the age of 3, who had died in the Tuam Mother and Baby Home in County Galway between 1925 and 1961, when the home closed, had come about through the research of Tuam native Catherine Corliss, who had begun investigating the home for an article in the Journal of the Old Tuam Society, a local historical publication, and became intrigued by the unmarked gravesite. In her article, Corliss speculated that the nuns who ran the home had converted a disused sewage tank into a burial vault, and that the dead children, some placed in coffins, but the bulk of them wrapped in shrouds, were placed there over more than 30 years, unnamed and unmarked. When international attention was brought to this burial site in 2014, visitors were able to make their way to it by walking through a housing estate of 3-bed semi-detached suburban homes that had been built on the site of the home in the 1970s, and across a large rundown playground of blue and yellow ramps, climbing frames, and swings. There they found a green square hemmed in on one side by an 8-foot stone wall, which in its entirety had once surrounded the home, and on the other by a smaller wall with 2 separate entrance gates, both with white crosses leading to the area. So that's it there. Local residents had been tending to this space since the mid-1970s after 2 local boys accidentally discovered skeleton bones in the area, which had until then become a dumping ground. At the time, authorities, including the police, the local council, and the Bon Secours Order of Nuns, the same order as had once run the Tuam home, suggested the bones were from famine graves and were content to say a few prayers at the site, to pour rubble all over the area, and to close it in. However, residents, perturbed by the fact that there were children's skeletons at the site, asked the council to level the ground and put down grass seeds. All the time, not knowing the identities of those buried below, the residents then built a grotto at the site, planted roses and creepers, and mounted a black granite plaque at the entrance inscribed with with images of the 2 angels and the words, "In loving memory of those buried here." And this was, I suppose, how people found the site then in 2014 when the media started paying attention to it and how it looked. And I suppose it stayed like that for about a year until the Mother and Baby Homes Commission, which had been set up by the Irish government in February 2015, following all the reporting, and this was to investigate mother and baby homes. They began a test excavation at the site and they sealed it off behind hoarding and site safety notices until September 2017. But on March the 3rd, 2017, the Commission announced that they had discovered a significant number of remains of babies and children buried underneath the site in a disused sewage tank, which confirmed Catherine Corliss's original speculations and prompted an outpouring of testimonials from former residents of the home and their relatives. And upon my second visit to the site, which was on March 18, 2017, I photographed bunches of flowers, soft toys, and then the names of all of the children and the ages of the children who had died at the home pasted up at the entrance to the site. There were also snow globes and coloring sticks and a kind of a makeshift memorial. And then the hoarding was removed by the Commission a few months later. And from that time on, really, former residents of the home, wider members of the wider Tuam community, and then local artists began to create a series of memorials and interventions at the gravesite, reasserting their rights to a space that had been described by former inmates as a prison, a place where they were always cold, hungry, and afraid, and of course, a place where they were hidden away both in life and death. This paper suggests that these acts of public reclaiming, of making visible what has for so long been concealed, operate as a kind of, quote, memorial cartography, a form of what Loeffler has termed tender and chaotic mappings, which she suggests are an engagement of spatial practices with the human condition, part of, quote, new cultural productions of spatial meanings that allow for an exploration of intimacy, in this instance with this former carceral site. For this seminar, I'll be focusing primarily on the vigil that took place at the Tuam gravesite during the visit of Pope Francis to Dublin in August 2018, with the consideration that these counter-topographies undertaken by the Tuam survivors at the gravesite allow them to, quote, access inheritances and resources that provide for them a language of belonging, allowing the excluded to reimagine how they might inhabit the spaces from which they and their ancestors were displaced. as well as offering them the possibility of mapping out new and potentially healing cartographies on still traumatic and liminal space. But before I move to a deeper discussion of these particular acts of reclamation, I'd like to offer some broader insight into my doctoral studies. And so my doctoral work at the National University of Ireland, Galway, with the Irish Studies Department, seeks to investigate the significance of unmarked burial sites in the Irish collective memory and culture. This research will consider other current and former carceral sites, including the unmarked grave site at the former Magdalen Laundry and Sundays Well in Cork City. So that's that there. And then it also incorporates the fact that Ireland has had a long tradition of surreptitiously and secretly burying its unwanted dead. In famine times, corpses could be carelessly interned in mass burial pits and covered with only a few shovels of earth. And that's a famine gravesite there. On the left, and there also exist Killeen sites where for centuries the stillborn, the unbaptized, the suicides and the infanticides were furtively buried on non-consecrated ground and with no clear marker indicating their existence. And that's an example there at the bottom left of a Killeen site. My project therefore situates a central but neglected aspect of the Irish landscape within the context of research, focusing on the unfinished history seething beneath. And I'm currently gathering thoughts and feedback in the areas of memory, trauma, and gender, as well as any comparative case studies of unmarked grave sites in other jurisdictions. And I'm bringing a practical, practice-based element into the PhD work as well, which would be creative writing, and I'm also gathering thoughts around that at the moment as well. So just in terms of turning again to the Tuam gravesite, there has been memorial cartographic work at places such as the unmarked burial site at Carceral, Cork, which is there at the top left, and at other former mother and baby homes such as Besper in County Cork or Sean Ross Abbey in County Tipperary. But the community and artistic interventions that have taken place at the Tuam mother and baby home are of particular interest, primarily because of the international press that has surrounded the work of Catherine Corless and the subsequent ongoing interest in the site, which has foregrounded the impact of these sites for non-Irish audiences. And because of its prominence in the national and the international imagination, the Tuam site also exists as a lens through which other former carceral sites in the Irish landscape can begin to be understood and re-inhabited by means of memory work, with memory work in this instance defined as naming, listing, recalling, restoring, accounting, as deferring, as listening, as speaking, and as claiming. And that's from Grunebaum. This was particularly in evidence when at least 1,000 people gathered at a silent vigil in Tuam, County Galway, on August 26, 2018, to coincide with the papal mass in Dublin, when Pope Francis marked the first papal visit to Ireland in nearly 40 years. And the vigil at Tuam was organised by a Manchester woman whose sister had vanished from a mother and baby home. It began when around 1,000 people assembled at the town hall in Tuam to walk the 30-minute route to the former mother and baby home. The crowd was made up of locals and also those who came from across Ireland and from abroad. They walked in silence to the site, passing teddy bears and cuddly toys that had been tied to gates and posts along the road. Upon arrival at the site, they placed a special sculpture made by a Flemish woman in the shape of a baptismal font at the site, while a small shrine of baby shoes and ceramic boots was arranged on the ground alongside candles in memory of those who died at the home. Nearby, a group stood holding placards with the names of the 10 women who had died at the mother and baby home. And also then some activists dressed up as crime scene investigators and installed crime scene tape at the site, calling for a full investigation. Small cream-colored cards were handed around with the names of the babies and their ages, printed in plain font, were handed around the crowd. And at 3 p.m, at the same time as Pope Francis was leading Mass at the Phoenix Park in Dublin, the crowd began to call the names of the babies aloud, one after the other, one on top of each other, in a kind of a chorus, with the names eventually shouted aloud so everyone present could hear them clearly. And the Irish Times wrote, "Out of nothing, all the voices started calling out the babies' names together. The playground was filled with a blizzard of names and strengthening voices." So I'm just going to try and share a little video, which is somewhere. One sec there now. Just hopefully I can get this. Oh yeah, there it is. So new share should be this. Okay, yeah. So hopefully you can hear and see.
Rachel, I don't believe it's working actually.
Say that again, sorry.
I don't believe it's working actually. There's nothing
Oh.
being shown on the screen.
Oh, sorry, I didn't share it properly. So maybe it's here. Can you see? Oh, sorry, James. This worked in when I practiced it earlier, and now, oh well. Now, can you see it? Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just bring it back just a tiny bit, and then it should.
Brandon McGreen, 2 months.
Patrick Joseph Coleman, 1 month. Annie Coyne, 3 months.
3 months.
3 sickening, 3 months.
So sorry, I didn't get all of that, but there was just a brief example of the crowd, I suppose, sharing the names. Okay, so just go back there. Right. Oops, sorry. Okay. So the vigil, I would argue, was both an example of public placemaking by which people can mark social spaces as haunted sites where they can return, make contact with their loss, contain unwanted presences, or confront past injustices. And it was also a public, highly visible acknowledgement of the quote, past lives and presences that occupy space-time beyond the realm of the living. The Irish Times journalist wrote that the event, quote, meant the overcast afternoon became charged with an unexpected and sudden voltage of energy and defiance, while Catherine Corliss, who was interviewed by RTÉ TV, said the vigil was an important message to church and state to say we are not forgetting the Tuam babies. Carmel Larkin, who was born in the Tuam mother and baby home and told RTÉ News that she'd never been able to trace her mother, called the vigil evidence of, quote, support and care from the people, not from the church or the state. The communal nature of the placemaking activity was also significant in that it offered a version of the communal care as described by Larkin, a care which survivors of Irish carceral institutions were denied in life and death. And the notion of care is also interesting to consider, given that mothers in the homes were expected to give it freely in the form of cleaning, doing the laundry and other gendered activities to redress their sins, but they were also told they were not capable of delivering a care to the children they birthed, but were not allowed to raise. The Tuam Vigil was also important because it represented a many-voice narrative, a form of oral history with participants presenting experiences in terms of emotional connection to place and space, rather than a single-voiced authoritarian narrative that has constituted both so much of traditional Western cartography, but also, of course, the single-voiced authoritarian narrative that has been for so long the preserve of the Irish Catholic Church and the Irish state. Meantime, the staged activities, the placards, the crime scene, the calling of the names created a form of, quote, visual, emotional vocabulary of the space. And finally, of course, the vigil was also an example of the making and remaking of meaning in place and of place, reminding us that, as Till notes, places are fluid mosaics and moments of memory, matter, metaphor, scene and experience that create and mediate social spaces and temporalities. Given
2 minutes, Rachel.
Okay, that's it then, almost finished. Given the survivors of carceral institutions have continued to voice their unhappiness at the manner in which they have been rendered voiceless by the Irish Church and state, you could suggest that the reclaiming of the Tuam site is an important perhaps even therapeutic intervention, an example of healing meaning making. Since the vigil in 2018, there have been further communal interventions at the site, candlelit ceremonies, temporary signs placed there saying excavate now. And perhaps the most salient was the removal of signs placed there. The signs were removed by Galway County Council following an outcry on social media. These placards here contain the public apology delivered by the Bon Secours sisters following the report of the Mother and Baby Home Commission. However, once they were placed there, activists on Twitter called it an intrusion into the space, and the council thus then took down the signs. And then finally, on my most recent visit to the site in September 2021, now I photographed a placard containing the names and ages of the babies, poems posted up there, and small handmade sculptures of dolls and booties. And these are examples of a powerful public engagement concerning the production of space and of a reclaiming of ownership of place by both survivors and the broader community. And they represent critical acts of memory work with those who were once forgotten, now allowed to be remembered and found. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rachel. Powerful, powerful work, very insightful, very fascinating to hear. And we really appreciate you taking the time to explain this wonderful research that you're doing. And it's so illuminating to hear, especially given the unfortunate circumstances surrounding the research. But thank you very much for your time. So third and finally, but certainly not least, is Joshua Shaw. Let me just introduce him here. Joshua Shaw is a PhD candidate at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Canada. His title of his presentation today is Carceral Geographies of Medical Jurisprudence Specimens. Joshua is a PhD candidate in Toronto, Canada. Joshua studies laws that affect the status, treatment, and disposal of human remains, with a special focus on contexts where such remains and related bodily matters become disposable. His interests are in legal and carceral geography, critical legal theory, and socio-legal studies, with outputs of his research published in peer-reviewed periodicals, such as Law and Critique, Law, Culture, and Humanities, and the International Journal of Law and Context. He is currently working on his dissertation, of which this work in progress forms part. And with that, I'm certainly, as we all are, very much looking forward to hearing about Joshua's work. So with that, I will hand over the reins to Joshua.
Hi there. I hope that you're only seeing the presentation itself and not my notes. Okay, fantastic. I'm also just going to minimize your lovely faces just so that I can see my notes. So good afternoon or good morning if you're in the North American area of the world. My name is Joshua Shaw, as James indicated, and I'm a PhD candidate at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto, Canada. And I'm also a junior fellow at the Royal Geographical Society and a member of this Carceral Geography Working Group. My paper is entitled Carceral Geographies of Medical Jurisprudence Specimens. It is derived from research that forms part of my doctoral dissertation. Specifically, it is derived from those portions of my dissertation that make up the third case study for which I'm still collecting data. So consequently, this paper is at a very early stage and is very much a work in progress. I hope that, despite it being a work in progress, that in presenting these early findings taken from the archives alongside sketches of how carceral spatialities may play a part in the legal status of human remains and bodily matters, that this can still be a productive conversation. I welcome, in particular, any insights that you may have as to how I might improve in my thinking around carceral geography, as well as any suggestions on how to draw out the spatio-temporal aspects of an archive that is principally constituted by text. A lot of the things that I'm looking at are text-based, but hopefully that's still of value for today. So just the last time I met with members of the Carceral Geography Working Group, I presented a paper at the Royal Geographical Society's annual meeting in 2019. And thanks to the comments from your group and those who were otherwise in attendance, I made revisions, and that paper has been published in International Journal of Law and Context. As I turn to the case study of medical jurisprudence specimens that I'll be discussing today, I have in mind the theoretical arguments that I started there, specifically in relation to how law relates to carceral geography, if we're trying to think through legal theory's engagement with space. So I just want to note that I see the legal as comprised of both material and immaterial affections that on occasion obtain the appearance of a certain solidity in text, but in actuality far exceed law's textual appearance and often find their principal expression in the movement of bodies and environs, which are always in flux as each act on each other. In doing so, how law may contribute to the formation of carceral spatialities can be brought into focus as a sensible phenomena for the legal scholar, but potentially also for the carceral geographer, going beyond the observation that the carceral relates to the law, perhaps a very superficial comment that one can make, and thinking more deliberately about the contribution of the legal form by which carceral spaces are enacted. So that is what I'm trying to think through, which I initially started to think through in this paper on the screen, but also am continuing to try and think through with respect to my dissertation. So I want to show you a series of images of documents found in archives. First, here is a page from the Lancet published in 1858. I found it in an archive in the custody and control of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada, among the fonds relating to an eminent pathologist in Ontario named Dr. Frederick Looney. It's not clear to me why this edition of the Lancet is among the fonds related to Dr. Looney. I don't know why Dr. Looney had it, because Dr. Looney was not yet born. He, I think, lived out most of his childhood in the early 1900s and became an adult in medical school around 1914. But I was drawn to the pages describing the activities of the Pathological Society of London, knowing that Dr. Looney was himself a pathologist and was one of the founders of North America's oldest pathology society, the Ontario Association of Pathologists. And I want to draw your attention to the text encompassed by the red brackets that I've inserted. I want to note the description in these summaries of how doctors, or perhaps others, were exhibiting certain specimens with audiences, again, probably made up of doctors, but potentially others as well who may have been involved with the Pathological Society of London. So we see that Dr. Gibb exhibited several preparations taken from a case of, and it provides an explanation of that, as well as Mr. Christopher Heath exhibited, and then a description of the specimen that was exhibited in the context of that case. And similarly with Mr. Simon exhibiting the specimen, again, to an audience members in person. Also within Dr. Looney's fonds were records of the specimens Dr. Looney held in his private personal museum. There are hundreds of such records, each a single page entry describing in detail the specimens found in the museum, including bones or soft tissue in large or small quantities and retrieved from doctors throughout Ontario. Dr. Looney even stored his own gallbladder in his museum that he retrieved from his childhood physician. And the microscopic slides were also apparently part of the collection that they would have been prepared from the gross specimen that was described and also stored in this personal private museum that he had. I'm showing you only a small portion of this document because I don't have permission yet to actually share anything of substance, but I wanted to give you some sort of visual feel for what this type of record looked like. Dr. Looney was also involved following the formation of the Ontario Association of Pathologists with organizing tissue seminars at their annual conferences that they would hold. His letters invite colleagues to share specimens from problem cases, which may be of interest to the members in attendance at the conference. This includes sharing the gross specimen to a designated laboratory who would prepare microscopic slides for attendees of the seminar. The gross specimen and tissues may be returned upon request. So often those sharing the tissue make a note, a very explicit note in their letters to specify that they would like the tissues returned for other projects that they're working on. In one letter, a pathologist wrote to Dr. Looney to inform him that he would not provide the gross specimen, or rather he could not, because unfortunately all he had left were a few microscopic slides. The specimen was inadvertently discarded, as so often happens, as he put it. So yes, it would seem that there were, like those exhibitions carried out by the Pathological Society of London, as documented in the Lancet, similar types of conferences or similar types of exhibitions were a very routine part of the Ontario Association of Pathologists. Interestingly, there were no references in the correspondence to the patient or next of kin in terms of consent or directions as to what may be done with the tissue. It seems, based on how the specimens were described, that these may have been retained without the patient or next of kin knowing. Although I admit I am speculating a bit here. However, it's an informed speculation because I think it's important to note that Ontario's Anatomy Acts in 1914, 1927, and 1937, which would have been around the time that many of these specimens would have been collected, did not authorize a person to donate their body, unlike the Anatomy Act of 1832 that was in place in the United Kingdom. Under Ontario's acts, much like the act that was put in place by Upper Canada in 1843, unclaimed bodies publicly exposed in public morgues or in the care of a public institution, like a hospital, were to be sent by the inspector of anatomy to medical schools. No one else was authorized to obtain such bodies. So it seems that the tissues could not have been obtained under the Anatomy Acts according to a patient or next of kin's consent. And it is unlikely that all the tissues Dr. Looney was interested in or collected were obtained under the narrow circumstances that the Anatomy Acts conceived. It seems likely that these tissues were taken from bodies in the doctor's charge, Dr. Looney's charge, as well as the charge of other physicians, and probably thought to be lawful, especially as I think about other case law and circumstances that I'll definitely talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. But indeed, in the Queen against Price, which was an 1884 case delivered by the Court of King's Bench in England and Wales, the court said that the common law was cognizant of uses of the dead like dissection other than sepulchre and authorized such uses. Instead, the Anatomy Acts were designed to procure a more ready supply of dead bodies to medical schools and were not intended to occupy the field, displacing this common law authority. And as we'll see, as I sort of hinted just a moment ago, this was not an anomalous view, it would appear, that law writers of the time held the view in their books on the disposal of the dead, which were being published in the late 19th century and up until the middle of the 20th century. And similarly, with the other case study that I want to highlight for you, it was also implemented in quasi-legal proceedings, this view of the law. Now, historically in the common law, bodies were obtained by surgeons in an institutionalized routine way by way of royal charter, issued first by King Henry VIII as part of his royal prerogative in 1540. Four executed convicts executed for the commission of a felony were sent to the United Company of Barbers and Surgeons in each year. Subsequent to the Royal Charter, the Murder Act of 1751 required the bodies of murderers convicted and executed in the counties of Middlesex and London to be delivered to surgeons for the purposes of dissection and anatomy, and allowed courts in other counties or any other place in Great Britain, including the colonies, to make such provision in the sentence of a convicted murderer. The bodies of murderers could also be hung in chains if the court directed for this, but as a murderer, the act prohibited their subsequent burial unless their bodies were also anatomized. The act sought to connect dissection and punishment by requiring such a sentence to be made in an open court, in which, and I'm quoting here, in which sentence shall be expressed not only the usual judgment of death, but also the time appointed hereby for the execution thereof, and the marks of infamy hereby directed for such offenders, in order to impress just horror in the mind of the offender and on the minds of such as shall be present of the heinous crime of murder. Now, similar implements are seen in British North American colonies, including Upper Canada, which is where present Ontario sits. But while the United Kingdom abolished the connection between punishment and dissection in the early 19th century with the Anatomy Act of 1832, Upper Canada was still replacing hitherto methods of corporeal and capital punishment with dissection. For example, with the offense of high treason, it was to be punished by dissection and anatomization instead of what was historically done by common law, being drawn and quartered, and which was often articulated in treason acts since the 14th century. And we see that in the red brackets at the bottom of this paragraph from an act implemented in 1833 in Upper Canada, changing from the classic punishment for high treason to dissection as punishment. So yes, this is and continued for well into the formation of, or right up to the Dominion of Canada being formed in 1867. The 18th century jurist Sir William Blackstone summarized the punishment for high treason in England as, and I quote, "very solemn and terrible. One, that the offender be drawn to the gallows and not be carried or walk, though usually by connivance, at length ripened by humanity into law, a sledge or hurdle is allowed to preserve the offender from the extreme torment of being dragged on the ground or pavement. Two, that he be hanged by the neck and then cut down alive. Three, that his entrails be taken out and burned while he is yet alive. Four, that his head be cut off. Five, that his body be divided into 4 parts. And 6, that his head and quarters be at the king's disposal." Whilst the spectacle of corporeal punishment was dissimulated with reforms that implemented dissection instead of being drawn and quartered, fundamentally the movement comprised by the phrase "at the king's disposal" and its apparent reference to the remainder that forms the monarch's prerogative over bodies of royal subjects seems to find expression in dissection as punishment as well. The king's charge over his subjects indeed allowed, as Upper Canada's Act pertaining to capital punishment did in 1833, courts to commute a death sentence to life imprisonment and yet still appoint the body of the life imprisoned prisoner to dissection. So in a way, the king, through the expression of the courts, was able to will the body away when others in the Canadas could not exercise such a legal power until well into the mid-20th century. This returns me to Dr. Looney's museum. As I said before, in The Queen against Price, the Court of King's Bench stated the common law was cognizant of uses of the dead, like dissection, other than sepulchre, and authorized such uses. And law books also gave countenance to this possibility. And a committee set up to investigate and adjudicate a disciplinary charge of a coroner, Dr. William Ramsay Smith of Adelaide in Australia, shared this view. They stated in their decision to let Dr. Ramsay Smith off, they said, "Before the Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed, it appears to us that the anatomical examinations were lawfully taught and openly practiced. The whole history of the subject shows that anatomy of the human body developed from most ancient times to a systematic practice, resulting in the establishment of schools and other institutions for that purpose. The Anatomy Acts, like the Royal Charter before it, were expedients to the obtainment of the dead, but not the basis of one's power to dissect in general. That existed prior to, alongside, and potentially well after the implementation of such legal instruments. In the case of Dr. William Ramsay Smith, it meant that the committee held he had not engaged in any unlawful practices when he dissected the remains of Indigenous peoples, outside his duties as coroner and outside those permissions set out in the Anatomy Acts. It enabled and preserved a museum collection at the University of Edinburgh, where Dr. Ramsay Smith sent many of his specimens and where many, to my understanding, remain today. And we see a similar case here in Toronto. Thank you. We see a similar case here in Toronto in 1850 with the Dr. John Scott at the Toronto Asylum, who would do some similar practices with his patients who died in the context of the asylum. And that's also one of my case studies. This evisceration to the body, the process of dissecting and anatomizing the body until specimens are separate from the person for whom the body once held and came to be known by, it continues into present legal practices. In this case, a pathologist who completed the autopsy on the victim of a murder in the 2000s insisted on demonstrating and was ultimately permitted to demonstrate his forensic theories on the victim's severed vaginal tissue and pelvis in court, in front of a jury. Such tissues up to this date have not been returned to the family of the victim, despite the trial having ended in 2021. The appeals were exhausted, and so the delayed return of the tissue and perhaps indefinite return of the tissue has meant that the family has not been able to give a proper final burial according to the practices of the Cree practices of burial. And so this, in my last moments, I just want to acknowledge how I'm thinking of carceral geography as part of this. So I'm thinking that carceral geography may help me in thinking through how the law creates distinctions between those remains that are provided a dignified final rest by sepulcher and those that become specimens and experience a very different disposal in terms of place, mode, and consequences thereof. A key to my thinking at this moment is Dominique Moran's work on embodiment and transcarcerality, in which corporeal changes bear the inscription of incarceration and enable the continuous enactment of carceral spatialities with respect to the embodied subject. These corporeal markers of imprisonment exist alongside and complement the formation of transcarceral spaces, which exceed the walls of conventional institutions of imprisonment and rearticulate carceral modes of control and domination in spaces otherwise not thought of as carceral. And so we might similarly think of the sentence that we see with capital punishment, with dissection as punishment, much like we might think of the sentence and enforcing of the imprisonment. It's causing the severance of the body into parts, which itself is sort of a corporeal marker that shapes how it moves in space to a more medial or interstitial stage of disposal. And which would transform the body from a subject to be interred into a specimen to be preserved and eventually discarded. And so I will happily talk more so about this in the Q&A, but hopefully that gives you a decent enough summary of what I'm working on right now, and hopefully that gives you enough information to help me perhaps think through the potential applications of carceral geography here. Sorry, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joshua. Fascinating work. You know, I'm familiar with the recent case study you mentioned about with the pictures being shown. And I think that's, you know, it's so important to have those types of conversations. And I think the way in which you're addressing some of the medical jurisprudence surrounding carcerality is so thought-provoking, and I say that, you know, recognizing that my own understanding of it is quite limited, but you know, having someone with more more analytical rigor that I think you provide is something that's so important to have. So thank you very much for sharing your work. I greatly appreciate it, and I know the rest of us do as well. So with that, I will now invite all of us to have a 5-minute comfort break. I recognize that it is probably about, it's 9:14 a.m. here in my province, but I know on I believe the running order would be about 4:14 for those of you who are in the UK. I believe that if we have about a 5-minute break to get up, stretch our legs, have a cup of coffee or tea or something stronger, if that's what you prefer or feel so inclined, we can then return here at, well, now that it's now 9:15, why don't we just return at 5 minutes from now? So at 9:20 or 4:20 or whichever variation of the hour that you might have right now. So I'll invite us all to have a 5-minute comfort break. Feel free to mute and to turn off your screen if that's what you prefer. And then we will begin in about 5 minutes to have our panel discussion with Dominique Moran. So I encourage you all to stick around, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in a few minutes' time.